Here we go.
Okay. So, I guess I'll start, if that's okay with you, Eileen.
Oh, yes. No, you're the introducer. Yes, thank
Okay.
you. I'll
Uh,
manage the chat. So,
okay. I'm Peter Cyrus. I'm the research director of Reform Elections now. And I know that many of you are used to tuning into these things and hearing me prattle on, but I'm not going to prattle on today. Instead, we have one of the smartest people I have ever met, and I'm usually very conservative with my comments, and one of the top constitutional scholars in the United States, and head of the Department of Constitutional Law at the Ohio State University, and Ned Foley. You can call him Edward, but I call him Ned. And Ned has come up with a concept that is really compelling called top three voting. And, I'd like to have him talk to us today about it. So, Ned, we're going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Peter. Thanks all of you. I can't possibly live up to that kind introduction, but I'll do my best. And I look forward to having a conversation about this idea. It's a relatively new idea, the specific version that we're going to talk about. There's a long lineage that it builds upon, but it's designed specifically, as this introductory slide shows, to deal with the problem of polarization. And I think we're all familiar with that problem. It's so urgent to deal with. But just to sort of start us off on the same page, I hope everybody has seen this slide, this next slide. There we go. This is from the Pew Charitable Trust, and they've documented the literally pulling apart of the American electorate over the last 3 decades. The last time they did a study in this particular way was 2017, and I think if they were to continue it to 2024, we'd see the two sides, coming even further apart than they were 2017. And I've been working with some graduates of the Stanford Business School. I'm sorry, it's Stanford and not Harvard, but the two young scholars got their PhDs at Stanford, and they can do computer analysis and number crunching that I can't possibly do. I'm a law professor and a lawyer by training, so I sort of understand the way in which these ideas relate to our democracy and the rules of our democracy, but I rely on other scholars for some of the data science that they can do. And what Scott Gantz, who's at Georgetown Business School as a professor, and Nate Atkinson, who's actually also has a law degree and at the University of Wisconsin Law School, they've taken some very well-respected political science, social science data called the Cooperative Election Survey that has thousands and thousands of voters from all across the country in the database, and they update it every year or two with new information in terms of election data and voter survey data and so forth. And from that, they have created models of the electorate of every single state in the country. Now, I'm not going to show you all of them, but here's an example of a particularly polarized state, Arizona. And if you compare it to the, Pew chart on the right, you can see Arizona is exactly a version of this. There's a lot of voters on the left, a lot of voters on the right, relatively few voters in the center. And the way to read all of these that I'm going to show you is on the x-axis, the horizontal axis, is a measurement of how partisan a voter is. And so if they're right in the middle at 0, 0, they're purely purple, to use that lingo, right? And on the right side of it, excuse me, is the red team. So the further right you go, the redder a particular voter is in terms of their partisan leaning based on their survey responses and their voting track record and all the data that's in this cooperative election survey database. And therefore, on the left side of 0, 0 is the blue side of purple. The further left you go, the bluer you are. So I think we all understand that. And so they measured, based on this survey data of the Arizona electorate, how many thousands of voters are at each point along the spectrum. And so we can see Arizona, as you know, is a so-called purple state, a battleground state, a swing state on the knife's edge. But that's not because everybody's on the 50-yard line, so to speak. It's like so many people are at the end zones and not so many people in midfield. And that's a real challenge for democracy. Political scientists have known since the 1950s that the more polarized an electorate is, the harder it is to achieve majority rule and majority results in an electorate. In the 50s, they were fortunate not to have as polarized a society as we do today. And we've got the challenge in our institutions that were built a long time ago and may have been adequate to handle American society post-World War II in the 50s and the 60s and so forth. As we've become more and more polarized, as Pew showed us, our institutions are getting stressed, and that's why we need the reform. So I'm just going to show you a few different state profiles before we get into the details of what reform to adopt. So not every state is like Arizona. So California has lots of voters on the left, not so many on the right. That tracks our understanding of California. Arkansas is almost the mirror image of California, obviously fewer voters, but the profile is essentially a lot of voters on the right, not as many on the left. But many of the states that we think of as either red or blue, in fact, exhibit polarization. Maybe not exactly like Arizona, but it doesn't take, Missouri, we now understand is a pretty red state. It's still a polarized electorate. There's just more voters on the right than on the left. And this line, this dotted line, is where the median of the electorate is. So, half of the voters are on the left side of the dotted line, half of the voters are on the right. And so when the median, moves to the right, that's a signal that you've just got more voters on the right side of the spectrum. So Missouri, very polarized, but still leans to the right. Mississippi is another example of that. Now, I introduced Alaska because, one of the most prominent reforms right now is in Alaska, the so-called top 4 system with ranked choice voting that you may be familiar with. There's a nonpartisan primary, kind of the way California has a nonpartisan primary, but instead of what California does, which is to have the top 2 vote getters in the primary, regardless of party, could be 2 Democrats or Democrat or Republican, whatever, top 2 go to the ballot in California. In Alaska, it's top 4, followed by ranked choice voting. And when I got interested in this topic after January 6, 2021, and thinking we really need reform in order to save our democracy, I hoped at the time that Alaska's system would be the solution for everybody. It was a model already built in Alaska. It was going to go into operation for the first time in 2022. So why reinvent the wheel if it's already been invented? But one takeaway that I want to leave with you from today is a system that can work in Alaska might not work in other states because these voter profiles of the electorate are different. Alaska, has more Republicans than Democrats and very few people on the left, but there's a lot of voters in the middle here in Alaska that's different from other states. So a reform that can work in Alaska because they're just voters in the middle to be captured under any electoral system isn't going to work again in Arizona when you've got that hollowed out middle in Arizona. And it turns out that many of our battleground states, our most competitive states, exhibit this hollowed out phenomenon. So here's Nevada. Nevada is voting this November on basically replicating Alaska's system in Nevada, and I hope it's successful because it's going to be better than the current system. But it is possible that the hollowed out nature of Nevada's electorate is going to make the Alaska method less successful for reasons that we'll see in a bit. Pennsylvania, another swing state, leans a little bit more to the left. See the dotted line here of the median voter is to the left of 0-0, but still polarized, still the hollowed out middle. Michigan has a little bit more of the middle. It also leans a little bit left, but it's still pretty polarized. Wisconsin, closer to 0-0. It's a very, purple state, but still pretty polarized. Two states that I want to focus on for today are North Carolina and my home state of Ohio, because the reform that I'm going to talk about, if we imagine how it had been adopted for the US Senate elections in these two states in 2022, so the last time those states had Senate elections, we might have seen a very different result. What happened in both those states is in the Republican primary, there was a MAGA candidate that was supported by former President Trump, who was an election denialist and much more of an extreme candidate. And then there was a moderate candidate trying to be associated with the traditional Republican Party. In North Carolina, it was a former governor, Pat McCrory. In Ohio, it was a state senator named Matt Dolan, who also tried to run in the Republican primary this time and was defeated again. My guess is that if there had been a better system, Rob Portman wouldn't have retired and would have tried to run in a middle lane between J.D. Vance, the Trump-endorsed election denialist who ended up winning, and then the Democrat Tim Ryan. But the system that we have in both North Carolina and Ohio today, the middle candidate gets knocked out in the Republican primary, and it's MAGA versus Democrat. And in states that have enough, Republican voters or voters on the right side of 0-0, if it's MAGA versus Democrat, you can end up with the election denialists. And that's what happened in 2022 in both those states. The winner in North Carolina was a guy named Ted Budd, who was one of the members of Congress who he wasn't the most leading the charge to object to President Biden's victory, but he was one of Trump's fairly strong advocates in the House of Representatives, along with Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz and all those folks, and he got rewarded essentially for that with now a Senate seat from North Carolina, defeating the Democrat. And as you know, J.D. Vance beat the Democrat in Ohio. So again, North Carolina has this profile. Alaska has a similar profile. Again, more voters on the right, pretty polarized. So now what I want to do, now that we've seen the electorates, I want us to start talking about the way in which different electoral systems interact with the same set of voters. So I'm going to come back to the first one that we looked at, Arizona, because again, it's very much a 50-50 state in a very polarized way. And so you've already, the figure on the left, you've already seen, you saw it by itself, but now we're going to compare the voters to winners, simulated winners. And this is what Nate and Scott and their colleague, John Mantis, have done. They have conducted 100,000 computer simulated elections for each state using different electoral systems. And so in every figure except the one on the left in the first slide for each state, we're actually looking at winners, the distribution of the winners given the voting system under consideration. So the first voting system to be considered is our conventional plurality winner general elections, which follow in November after a partisan primary. And the difference between the two versions of this, Delta 1, Delta 2, is just their mathematical technical term for how partisan the voters in the primaries are. So when Delta is 1, what that means is that the voters in each primary are no more extreme than the electorate as a whole. So you're not skewing any further. Obviously, the voters in the Democratic Party are on the left side of the spectrum. Voters in the Republican primary are on the right side. Turnout may be lower in a primary than a general election, but there's a congruence between the primary vote. If you put both primaries together, the red primary and the blue primary, you will have an electorate that has the same overall profile as the general electorate over here on the left. So even when that's true, you see we don't get any winners from the center under our current system. The winners clump on the left side or the right side in a 50-50 state like Arizona. When Delta is 2, meaning that the voters are even more partisan, either blue or red, than the electorate as a whole, you get even more polarized results. Because the primaries select who the general election candidates are going to be, and so you can only have winners who already are more to the right and more to the left. So that's the baseline system that we currently know, and then they take the same electorate and examine 3 different systems. So so here we are, Arizona again. We're not looking at the voters anymore. Same voters, 100,000 elections for each of these different systems. And the first system is the California system. So the way they simulate that is they pick 10 candidates randomly drawn from the profile of the electorate. So like, just imagine 10 Californians wanting to run for a statewide office in California. Could be Senate, could be governor, whatever. And then they go to the top 2 primaries. So the voters vote according to which candidates are closest to them. They only get 1 vote in the primary for whoever candidate is closest to them. And as a result of that, then there's a general election between the top 2 candidates. Every voter again votes for the candidate closest to them. And you get a pretty polarized distribution of winners, not quite as polarized as under the conventional system that most states use, but still pretty polarized. Now, what's interesting to me, especially interesting about their study, is this middle figure here called IRV winners. That's the Alaska system, because the Alaska method of ranked choice voting is called instant runoff voting in the literature, and its methodology produces polarized results. So what this simulation is 100,000 elections. In each election, 10 candidates are randomly picked from the voter profile, the same voter profile of the state, and the voters pick each voter picks 1 favorite candidate, and the top 4 candidates go to the general election where the ranked choice methodology is used. And the methodology that Alaska uses actually produces a more polarized result in Arizona. Again, this is the Arizona electorate. It's the Alaska system, but the Arizona electorate than the California system does. California is less polarizing in Arizona, the California system, than the Alaska system. The system on the right is what we're going to talk about soon. My proposal is a version of this. This concept comes from a French mathematician philosopher named Condorcet, and there's a bunch of different Condorcet systems. The one that my colleagues modeled the election on was a Condorcet variation of the Alaska system. So still uses ranked ballots, still has the same nonpartisan primary, still picks 4 candidates from the primary to be in the general election, and then uses a Condorcet method of finding the winner from the ranked ballots. And the point here is you get much less polarized results. And I think we'll see why when we get to studying the system in more detail. The top 3 system, just to preview it till we study it closely, it uses the same kind of nonpartisan primary that California does, or Alaska does, or this Condorcet variation does. In other words, all candidates from all parties, independent candidates, they're all on the ballot in the primary. And then voters vote for their favorite candidate. And unlike California, where 2 advance, unlike Alaska, where 4 advance, in my proposal, 3 candidates will advance to the general election, and then we'll study how the general election works. But the thing to notice right here is that the Condorcet methodology is getting you less extreme winners than the instant runoff or Alaska method. And just to show you how the differences, why the Alaska method works for Alaska, but not necessarily for Arizona, you've already seen the voter profile of Alaska and how it's much less polarized. Again, the conventional electoral method still is more polarizing than the electorate itself. That's the problem that we have in America right now, is that our existing electoral system in most states magnifies the polarization that already exists. And even in a state that isn't polarized, it creates polarization in that state. But California's system would actually do pretty well in Alaska with a less polarized electorate. And the Alaska system also does pretty well in Alaska, because you'll get some moderate winners like Lisa Murkowski and others like her, given the profile of the Alaska electorate. A Condorcet system will still get you more winners towards the center, given its properties, but the Alaska system does pretty well. And if you focus your eye on this middle figure, the IRV winners in Alaska, and then you look again what we already saw in Arizona, just see how the middle gets completely hollowed out in Arizona with the same system. So you've got a middle in Alaska, and the middle disappears in Arizona. That's kind of the main thing that we need to worry about and try to figure out how to solve that. So now, again, we could talk, I mean, we need reform in Arizona, we need reform in all the polarized states. Again, I want to show you just how impactful the top 3 proposal would be in states like Ohio and North Carolina, remembering who the 3 candidates that I talked about in 22 were in those states. Again, you had a MAGA candidate, a Democratic candidate, and you had a moderate Republican who wanted to be competitive, but couldn't be competitive under the existing system. And we see that for Ohio. Clearly, Ohio has the plurality system that most states have, and a moderate like Rob Portman or Matt Dolan just can't compete under the current system because the middle, gets hollowed out. And even under the top 2 system that California has, again, you'd get a few centrist candidates winning, but look at what Alaska does. It's Alaska is like Arizona in that Ohio is like Arizona in that you cannot use Alaska's system successfully if you're trying to depolarize, if you're trying to have good government, to have people who are willing to compromise like Rob Portman. They could be Democrats who want to compromise like Joe Manchin. They could be Susan Collins. They could whatever, but you're not going to win. You're not going to get centrists elected to Congress from Ohio using Alaska's system. You need a Condorcet system. Same thing with North Carolina. Again, here's North Carolina's electorate. They also have the same conventional system of plurality winners. Pat McCrory, even though he could win as a governor in the old days, given the increased polarization, can't win a primary, and you're not going to get a moderate Republican or moderate Democrat winning under the conventional system in North Carolina. Top two will do a little bit better. Instant runoff voting does a little bit better in North Carolina than maybe in Ohio, but still not very better. You need a Condorcet system. Okay, so we've now looked at all the data from Nate and Scott and John, and we're going to put that behind us. We can come back to it if you want to later. But now I want to focus on this particular version of a so-called Condorcet system that we're calling top three, for the reasons that I said. There are going to be three candidates on the ballot in November. Why this particular idea? A couple of reasons. One is this Gallup poll is showing us, and this is a poll that they've given, for 2 decades now, and the takeaway from this is more Americans want a third party, a third major party who can be competitive with the other two parties than ever before. This 63%, which came from last October, the most recent time that they've done this survey, the highest it's ever been. And correspondingly, the existing parties do an adequate job, the lowest it's ever been. The public is hungering for that third alternative. We know this year in the presidential race. Everybody is saying, why do we have these two choices? Can't we have a third choice? The system doesn't accommodate a third choice. If we had a Condorcet-based presidential election system, we would have a third choice that would be very competitive against the two major party nominees that we expect. But we don't have that system, but the public wants it. So let's give them what they want, both for Senate elections, governor elections, presidential elections. This top three system could apply to any election. So what does it look like? So now I'm going to kind of give you an abstract version of this that I hope you'll see some similarities to the real data that we got from Nate, Scott, and John. So let's imagine an electorate where 45% is on the left and they vote blue. 15% are in the middle. They want a middle candidate, and 40% are on the right. Again, polarized electorate, right? 45 on one side, 40 on the other, the middle, not so big. So we've seen that already this hour. To know who would win under the conventional system or in any other system besides our top three system or a Condorcet system, we have to know the second choice preferences of the purple voters. So let's just say that they divide this way. So a smaller fraction would go blue, a larger fraction would go red. Again, I have in mind in particular North Carolina and Arizona are states that might end up this way, right? You've got a competitive Democrat, you've got a competitive MAGA Republican. There is that centrist candidate who would like to compete, but can't compete under the current system. They either won't bother to run, and if they don't run, red is going to beat blue 51-49 because the voters who prefer the purple candidate will go one side or the other. And with this profile, more will go to the red side. And even though the MAGA candidate only has 40% support, whereas a traditional Democrat has 45% support in a state like Ohio or North Carolina, the splitting of the purple coalition can force a J.D. Vance on the population or force a Ted Budd, even though the voters would prefer that middle candidate, or at least the swing voters would. And same thing, even if, as we see with Ohio and North Carolina, even if they try to run in the primary, if they can't get through the primary or they can't get through a top two kind of runoff, you're going to end up with that same 51-49 result in this particular state. And now I'm just going to show you with this profile why the Alaska system of instant runoff voting can't give us a different result. So these are the same preferences on a ranked ballot. So 45% of the voters want blue the most. They want MAGA red the least. They want purple second best. 40% just the opposite, want red the most, blue the least, purple in the middle. And here is those purple voters who split their second choices and therefore, of course, split their third choices. And with the instant runoff method in Alaska, that methodology is to knock out the candidate with the fewest first place votes. So your middle candidate gets knocked out immediately. Ballots get redistributed to whoever is ranked second on the ballot. And lo and behold, you get the same result that we see again and again under these different systems, 51-49. Here's how the top three system is different. We could use ranked ballots to run a top three election, but we don't have to. And there is so much hostility right now to ranked choice voting within the Republican Party. I'm trying to offer an alternative that says, hey, wait, look at this. If you're a moderate Republican, this will actually help you. Don't be so hostile to election reform. The platform of the Republican National Committee, believe it or not, is saying that ranked choice voting should be made illegal in every state for every election, whether it's statewide, local, what have you. There's just a virulent hostility to it. We could guess why. I think it's because in some of those Alaska races where it was first used in 2022, moderate Republicans lost high-profile races, not just MAGA Republicans, in races where in a so-called Condorcet system, the moderate Republican would win. So I don't think ranked choice voting is inherently problematic, but the particular version of it can lead to some anomalous results, not as anomalous in Alaska as in Arizona and Ohio or North Carolina, but nonetheless, the Alaska system unfortunately caused a lot of heartburn that we have to overcome. So what we could do in our top three system is have what I'm calling a direct top three election. And what that means is voters would vote between each pair of candidates directly. So you'd vote blue versus red, blue versus purple, purple versus red. Voters would just express their direct preferences between each pair of candidates. So here's how it would work. Let's say the first thing on the ballot is blue versus purple. Blue's going to get the 45% that like blue. But with the preferences that we've already seen, purple is going to beat blue because all the red voters prefer purple to blue. So purple wins pretty decisively, 55-45, showing majority support for purple. When purple goes up against red on the same ballot and voters vote their preferences, red's going to get 40%. That support red, but now blue is going to pick up the purple support because all the blue voters prefer purple to red. So now purple is going to beat red by a whopping 60-40. We've already seen the third direct comparison. It's that same blue versus red that's 51-49 under all the other systems. But this system finds the true majority preference. Purple's majority over each opponent is stronger than red's majority over blue. So if we're really trying to find the candidate that majority of voters in this polarized electorate most prefer, it's actually purple. Even those purple first choice preferences are smaller, purple is the consensus candidate or the compromise candidate because it gets all of that second choice support against either of the extremes. And you can see that you don't need a ranked ballot. You could see that directly. This is much harder to do with 4 candidates in a top 4 system, because with 4 candidates, there are 6 direct head-to-heads. With 5 candidates, there are 10 direct head-to-heads, and it wouldn't be fair to ask voters to vote that many, head-to-head comparisons. But when it's only 3 candidates, it's not any harder to vote 3 direct head-to-heads than to fill out a ranked choice ballot. In fact, it might be more intuitive to voters. And since voters aren't clamoring at the moment for 4 parties or 5 parties or 6 parties, let's take one step to a better reform, and give them a 3-party system, if you will, by having a top 3 election. And if you utilize the top 3 election in Ohio and North Carolina in 2022, that moderate Republican would have won. And I don't say this from a partisan perspective. It's just that Ohio and North Carolina lean a little bit to the red. Given the profile of those voters, it would make sense that in a top 3 system, the candidate would be a more moderate Republican, like a Rob Portman or a Pat McCrory, not an extreme MAGA Republican like a J.D. Vance or Ted Budd. And Democrats can occasionally win, and more often in North Carolina than Ohio. But Democrats are going to have a hard time in a state that leans red. That's democracy. So I'm going to pause here. There's some technical details that we could explore if you're really interested in this. There's more to be said about the top 3 system than I've said already. And if you wanted to see what a top 4 system could look like with Condorcet principles, I could show you that. But I've been talking for a while, and I'd rather this be a conversation, so we could come back to some of those technical details if you want. But this is the gist and essence of the idea.
Hi, Ned. I'd like to ask a question. So how do you get to the top 3? So let's say that you have a primary and it's everybody, it's a nonpartisan primary. Is that the way it works?
Correct. I think that, I mean, you could try to do this with partisan primaries. I don't recommend it, because our party system is rigid at the moment. I think to get the best bang for the buck, you would have the same kind of primary they have in California and Alaska and Washington State. There are a few other states that have moved to nonpartisan primaries. You could have, Alaska had a nonpartisan primary with 40 candidates on the ballot. That's, you don't need that many candidates. California often has 20 or 30 candidates running for governor or senator. Again, you don't necessarily need that many candidates, but you have a few Republicans, few Democrats, few independents. And then the easiest way to do that is just have a voter vote for their most preferred candidate. A simple pick one, and whoever gets the most votes advances. But whoever gets the most votes depends on the number that are allowed to advance. California allows 2 to advance, Alaska allows 4 to advance. You could allow just 3 to advance. That's the simplest way to do it. There are other ways to do it that would actually be more effective at depolarizing, and I'm happy to talk about that. But if we're trying to get a simple system that that the public could understand easiest, I'd say same as what California uses. We're just going to have 3 candidates go on the ballot to November instead of 2.
So if it was let's just take the presidential election because that's simple. If it was Biden, let's say you had a group of people and it was Biden, Trump, RFK Jr., and then let's say a unity ticket of Larry Hogan and Amy Klobuchar. I'm just making up a ticket. It's, I'm not advocating. If you ended up with the first 3, Biden, Trump, and RFK Jr., you'd be in the same position you are now, basically.
Yes, but I think my own strong belief, and you tell me if you think this is wrong, is that if you had the primary if you use this kind of system for the presidential election, RFK would try to win, so would Cornel West, so would the Green, right? I mean, there's a couple of other
Right.
minor candidates, but I think the top three would be Biden, Trump, and your unit, the Hogan, or I mean, I think Nikki Haley, Larry Hogan, Joe Manchin. I have a hard time believing that RFK would get one of the top three spots.
No, I agree with you. The John, you want to ask John? John just posted a question. You want to ask your question, John? Unmute yourself, and ask.
Yeah, if my sound works. How does an election method get approved for actual use in a given election? Thank you.
Yes, very important. It's not good enough just to have ideas, you got to get them implemented. The good news, this is a glass half full, half empty story. The half full part of the glass is that literally half the states in the country have ballot initiative mechanisms, which allow citizens to gather signatures and put a proposal on the ballot and then hope the citizens will vote for it. That's how California got its top two system. That's how Alaska got its top four system. It's how Washington got, in fact, Washington state adopted the top two system even before California did. And again, Ohio has a ballot initiative process, so does Florida, so does Michigan. Unfortunately, North Carolina doesn't, Pennsylvania doesn't. It's going to be harder to get these reforms adopted in states without ballot initiatives unless a coalition of Democrats and moderate Republicans see this as saving our democracy from extremism. I had hoped that that kind of coalition would form after January 6th, and there would be a partnership between Republicans appalled by January 6th and what happened, and Democrats to try to come up with a system like this to isolate, MAGA type extremism. But that's not where the Democratic Party went in its reform efforts between 2021 and 2022, unfortunately. But I'm like Sisyphus pushing up the rock, or Don Quixote. It's like, let's try to get this adopted until it is adopted, because I think we really, really need it. So it's going to be easier to do in an initiative state. The great thing that's happening in Arizona right now is they're putting on the ballot, or they're gathering signatures right now for a proposal that is flexible enough to have this system, but doesn't mandate the system. It would mandate the nonpartisan primary component of the system, and then let the legislature choose either top two, top three, top four, choose between the instant runoff method and the Condorcet method. So it's like a halfway step to the really good reform, but halfway is better than no way in terms of pragmatic efforts. So I'm really excited about what Arizona is doing. Montana is also doing a version of this a little bit differently. Montana is having a ballot initiative that would put in the state constitution a requirement that candidates win elections with a majority of votes. That sounds innocuous. I mean, everybody believes in majority winning, right, already, and yet that's not our current system in most places. That plurality rule that I showed you as the baseline system in every state is what's really, really polarizing the most. And so Montana would say, you have to have some majority system. It could be California top two, it could be Alaska top four, it could be Foley's top three, anything, but it's got to be a majority system. That would be a great reform if Montana adopted it. I had really, really hoped that Congress would adopt for congressional elections to the House and Senate that simple majority winner requirement. I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post in March of 2021, shortly after January 6th, trying to figure out how could we get out of this terrible polarization. And it would be a simple one-line statute. To win a seat in Congress, you need a majority of votes. That's it. Doesn't have to be an 800-page law, like the Democrats tried to pursue for 2 years until it fell apart. Just a one-line sentence. Unfortunately, there wasn't appetite for this because the Democrats tried to push a reform that they were never going to get and never going to convince any Republicans. And unfortunately, obviously, there's a lot of blame to go around. But when I heard the lead lawyer for the Democratic Party say, well, because not a single Republican in Congress supports our HR1 S1 bill, not Liz Cheney, not Lisa Murkowski, not Mitt Romney, because none of them support our bill. That just shows that every Republican is against democracy, and the only Democrats are for democracy. And I thought, no, you don't understand. That just shows that your bill is a partisan bill and not a broad coalition bill that would get support from reasonable Republicans as well as Democrats. So I think that the Democratic Party squandered a huge opportunity for serious reform, unfortunately, when they had majorities in the Senate and the House until the end of 2022. We did get the Electoral Count Reform Act, thanks to Mike and Peter and many of you and the good work. That was essential to do. But that got done just in time before the end of 2022. And we have got to get some bipartisan reform along these lines, I think, or else polarization is going to kill us.
Ned, I wanted to make 2 comments to what you just said. First, in Nevada, which is a state you mentioned is trying to get ranked choice voting, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe that every statewide office except for one in the last election was decided where the winner ended up with less than 50% of the vote.
Yeah, I think that's
and I believe the one where they got 50% was a Republican win, and the only others were Democratic wins with 47, 48%. Also, you talked about Republican resistance to this. What's interesting is, to me at least, is if you had this Condorcet top 3 system in Arizona in the last election, or in the previous, not the last election, but previous elections, my guess is that Jeff Flake would have ended up as the winner, would have come in third and would have been the winner, and the Republicans would have had control of the Senate.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think he would have been the kind of candidate who would build coalitions from both sides to defeat the extremes from either side. And I think you can see that in Arizona this year. I mean, whether you agree with her or not, Senator Sinema from Arizona was trying to occupy a middle lane. She got disowned by her own Democratic Party for building bridges across the aisle, literally to build bridges with Rob Portman and get things done. So she got primaried from the progressive left, and so she changed, and her party registration became independent. Thought about trying to run as an independent. You can't do it under the current plurality system, and so now you're going to get a progressive Democrat will probably beat the MAGA election denialist Carrie Lake from the opinion polls that I've seen. But if it had been a 3-way top 3 race of the Condorcet kind that I'm showing you, I'm pretty confident that Sinema would have beaten both the progressive left and the MAGA right. So sometimes it benefits a moderate Democrat like Sinema, sometimes it benefits a moderate Republican like Flake. it benefits in a world of polarization, the candidate who's trying to depolarize and govern on behalf of everybody. That's the goal here.
But it's interesting in Arizona, a state that you mentioned, where in the last two Senate elections, the candidate who reached out to the middle was destroyed by the partisans in their own party. And you had an election with MAGA people on, with partisans on either side, and the middle got destroyed.
Right. And you mentioned Nevada. The Democratic Party in Nevada is trying to block the reform there. The same Democratic lawyer who I mentioned said there's not a Republican in Congress and believes in democracy, which is a ridiculous thing to say from my nonpartisan perspective. He's leading the litigation to try to destroy Nevada's use of nonpartisan primaries, followed by an Alaska-style ranked choice voting. I hope that reform passes, even though it's not a Condorcet reform, because it's better than the status quo, and there's reasons to think it would improve the situation in Nevada. But it's not just Republicans who are opposing reform; it's the institutional Democratic Party that's doing so as well, at least in that state.
I see Lucy's got her hand up. Could we see what her question is?
You mentioned that Republicans are writing laws to prohibit ranked choice voting, which astonishes me. And thank you for the explanation, Ned. That was great. I'm wondering what the reception is to what you propose, and particularly among interest groups who might be in a position to lobby for it or create citizen initiatives like Fair Vote or open primaries or even Common Cause or some of the bigger groups.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I would say that there's been positive movement over the last couple of years. I really first introduced a version of this again in 2021, and the first version of Condorcet that I put forward was a ranked choice voting version of it, because I said, let's just tweak the Alaska system and make it consistent with Condorcet principles instead of the instant runoff method that they use. And the reaction that I got initially from the reform groups, I'll be candid, was polite resistance. Fair Vote in particular, strongly resistant. And they can speak for themselves, but their view on this is they're working so hard to get what they call regular ranked choice voting adopted. They don't want any other reform idea to distract from what they're trying to get adopted. They're at least to me, they're candid about that as their reasoning process. And my attitude is I approach this the way I think doctors should approach this medicine and how to treat a sick patient. I want to treat the sick patient of our body politic that's infected by polarization with whatever medicine is least, powerful, right? Because you don't want to, do anything stronger than necessary. And so if the Alaska system as it exists would work, again, it's, just take it off the shelf and apply it to Arizona. So that was my initial attitude. It was only realizing that the more polarized the state is, you might need some stronger medicine. I said, well, what would that stronger medicine look like? And that's why I started exploring this Condorcet concept. So, I would have hoped that the reform community would be pragmatic in that way. I will say some of the other groups are getting more interested. There's a group called Unite America, you may have heard of.
Yeah.
They were initially a little bit skeptical, but lately I was at a conference of theirs last month, and they let me present this, and it got a decent reception. And interestingly, another political scientist, a different person from Georgetown, the political science department, who had initially been quite skeptical of Condorcet himself for other reasons, ended up doing his own computer analysis showing that Condorcet would actually make quite a bit of difference in congressional elections. So, we're gaining some converts slowly. I wouldn't say, we've converted everybody and that these groups are ready to run, but the interest is growing, I think is accurate to say.
That's encouraging. I hope you'll think of a different name.
Yeah, well, right. We're not going to call it and I'd love this to be kind of a focus group on this. We definitely, I'm calling it to Condorcet to you because we're among friends, but absolutely can't call it Condorcet. I'm happy to call the top 3 system just top 3, and then
that stands on its own. But
No.
French names generally don't do well in America.
But the latest paper that I've written about the top 3 systems specifically, and I'm trying to tie it back to our founder. I actually do believe in some details that I didn't get to, which we could at another time if you want, or whenever. There's a particular version of the top 3 system that I think is the system that James Madison would have most preferred if he had been aware of this mathematics of elections. He was interested in Enlightenment political philosophy. He had read Montesquieu, he had read Rousseau, and all of that. He just hadn't read the latest, science from across the ocean. But so I do think a version of this is the system truest to our founding principles for reasons I could discuss. But the name that I latched onto for that purposes is convergence voting, because what the Condorcet mathematics does is it converges on that more moderate center-oriented candidate who can build coalitions in the way that I showed that the purple candidate could, right? The 2 different majorities converge upon that purple candidate who can beat the red candidate and the blue candidate. So I don't know, do you think convergence voting is a plausible name, or should we just call it top 3?
I have an opinion on that, but I think we should let Benjamin Bromberg speak. He's next in line.
I might have taken Mike's spot, but I'm not sure. Anyway, so I think it's pretty clear that the system rewards moderates, but the concern I have is I'm not sure the existing 2 parties necessarily want moderates, and then on top of it, it's going to be pretty tough convincing people that someone who comes in with only 11% to start is somehow the victorious candidate. So just those 2 things seem to be pretty big impediments to getting this across.
Yeah, so absolutely. So on the first one, again, I come back to the way to get it adopted is through these ballot initiatives where you hope that the support and the messaging of the campaign, and there hasn't yet been a campaign trying to get this adopted in a state like Ohio or Michigan or what have you. And I think some of the groups that are interested in this down the road are trying to think, through opinion surveys and focus groups, like how should this be messaged if they were going to put money behind a big public messaging campaign, knowing that the 2 parties might come out to try to attack it. What would that look like? So I do think that's an incredibly important point. Remind me of the second one is also really important. Just remind me of it again.
Yeah, it's just that the candidate with only 11%
right
is the one that ends up winning, just because they're the least worst choice for the other side.
Absolutely. So you really literally see that in a ranked choice version of this, because if you use a ranked ballot where people rank their choices, you'll see that purple candidate only gets 11% or 15% or whatever. The beauty of the direct head-to-head methodology is, I showed you those underlying preferences in order to so that you could sort of look under the hood and see how the mathematics work. But if the only official results in a top three system would be the results that show purple beating blue 55-45 and purple beating red 60-40 and red beating blue 51-49, you wouldn't ever see 11% or 15%. Those numbers wouldn't be part of the electoral method.
That's a very good point. Yep, that makes sense.
Can I pick
I
up
just
on a
want to
couple of
make one
things?
comment, Mike, which is my guess is after this election in November, that 11%, I don't think you're going to see purple at 11%. I think you're going to see purple at a much higher number because whichever side wins in November, you're going to find a lot of dissatisfied people. I just wanted to ask a question. Linda Sweeney wrote a text. How can we learn details about the Condorcet method so we can explain it to doubters? Ned, can you send over some of your articles and we'll distribute it to our entire mailing list?
Yes, I'll put some things in the chat as we talk, and then if there are others, I'll just email them to you and then you can distribute
Okay.
them.
Great.
Okay, I wanted to bring back one thing I don't think that got mentioned earlier, is that that it eliminates the spoiler effect,
Yes.
which has been a major thing. And I have two other comments. One is that I believe that the top three shouldn't be called top three because it makes it sound too much like top two or top four or top five, which it's really not, because it's not like top two because it permits a third party to get into the final round. And it's not like top three or four, or excuse me, 4 or 5, because it doesn't have ranked choice voting. You've already mentioned some of the drawbacks of that, in addition to exhausted ballots and the fact that the person that did the worst job on picking the second choice or the first choice on the first round gets to get his vote count in the next round. And I think the idea that the moderate always wins, I don't think you should sell it on the basis of the moderates. The fact is, one of the left or the right can also win if they really are going to get 50% of the vote. So
Absolutely true. Yeah.
and so that really isn't going to force it. It happens we've got a situation this election where people are particularly dissatisfied with the top two. And that's kind of unique, but I don't think we should be pushing it based on it being electing a moderate. It could elect somebody that's to the left or the right, presumably not one that's a total extremist or part of a small minority that is dictating terms by being the arbiter, basically to be able to get through the process.
Well,
I think the simplicity is also a virtue of top three, because you are ending up with a head-to-head competition. And I prefer the terminology that you've used before, Ned, which is top three round robin. To me, that's the best descriptor. There are enough people that have involvement with athletics that they can understand it quickly. It is pretty straightforward, and it doesn't have all these difficult complexities that ranked choice voting gets into when you can have more than one way of executing it. So I vote for top two round robin, excuse me, top three round robin, and not sell it just as a way to get a moderate elected, but as to get somebody that really the majority of the population supports.
Yeah, no, I mean, I obviously am happy to call it round robin. It's there's a group of academics who are interested in Condorcet that I've become involved in, and they're trying to also focus group on what to call it. And for some reason, they don't like round robin that I haven't figured out. But I like round robin, obviously, and maybe the focus groups will prove that correct. The point that you make about it isn't just moderates. It's absolutely true. I actually think if the top three system were in this year's presidential race, Biden probably wouldn't have felt the need to run. Whether he should have run anyways, that's a different matter, because it would have been very easy for another Democrat to say, well, you could have two Democrats could be among the top three or whatever. And Biden said, well, this system is going to be fine. And so it's quite likely that, I don't know who, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, somebody else might have beaten, both Larry Hogan and Trump or whatever. So what it does do is exactly what you said, Mike, is it causes anybody not to stray too far, right? You can still be blue, you can still be red, you just can't be, really extreme. I think you're 100% right about that.
Eileen, I think you've got your hand up.
Yes, I back the top three round robin because I watch a lot of sports, and I had listened to Condorcet in our internal meetings. And then once I looked at the invite, because I watch tennis, and I thought, oh, it's like match play, and who's ever the best at match play. So,
all right, match play. I like that term.
We need to find how to get into your focus group, Ned. Much as I love academics, I'm not sure they're always the best at marketing things.
Absolutely correct.
But, I just want to say the point that you're making is that, if you look at our traditional system, you have Trump catering to his base, you have Biden catering to his base, and leaving aside RFK Jr., you had nobody standing up to say, hey, I'm a better alternative, because there was no labels, fooled around for months looking for somebody. The reason they couldn't find anybody was there was no way that anybody else could be competitive. But with this kind of system, you could get a moderate candidate or a different candidate who could be competitive. So I think it's a fascinating system. So the last question I'll ask you is, are there states that you think would be particularly interesting for an initiative like this?
Yes, I mean, I do think Ohio, not just because I'm here, but I think what Florida also maybe, in other words, I think where this could make the most difference, and it depends a little bit on what what your goals would be if you were a reform organization. One of the things that I noticed after 2022 is the mainstream media, which, let's face it, does lean a little bit to the left. Their messaging out of the 22 elections is that election denialism got whooped at the ballot in all of these states. And it is true that in every state that Biden won, an election denialist like Carrie Lake in Arizona or Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, they couldn't win. So the takeaway that I thought as a result of that was, is that in a state that leans blue, if the Republican Party strays too far to the right, the Democratic Party has the capacity to police that in the general election. Now, there's a risk of the Democratic Party straying too far to the left, and so it depends really on what your main goal is here. But the states that I think where this idea is particularly worthwhile are states that lean a little bit red, because that's where the Democratic Party can't be competitive. We see again and again, this is why I focused on Ohio and North Carolina. This would be true in Florida, be true in Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Missouri, Iowa, all of those states. If the general election has a MAGA candidate who has won the primary and a Democrat, MAGA is going to win. And so that's why we're seeing is the MAGAification of Congress in both the House and the Senate is because of the structure. It's not because the average voter in Missouri or Iowa wants to be MAGA. They just want to be Republican. And if the only Republican that they have is MAGA, they vote MAGA over Democrats. So Missouri is a state that has ballot initiatives. So, Missouri, Ohio, Florida, any state that leans a little red, and you're worried about MAGA taking over the Republican Party, I would have thought, and here's where I would appeal in those states to the self-interest of Democrats. I tell people, Democrats in Ohio, look, maybe Sherrod Brown can win this time, but he's the last gasp to be able to win as a Democrat statewide. Otherwise, Republicans are going to win. So wouldn't you Democrats rather have a moderate Republican winning than, an extreme Republican? And if so, can't the Rob Portman wing of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party join forces to say, we like this idea, we're not going to trash this idea? Because that is a majority, right? The MAGA crowd does not have a majority in any of these states. They just leverage the system to win power. So now,
but Ned, in some states, we talked about Arizona, where I argued that Jeff Flake would have won. If you another sort of purple but blue leaning state, as opposed to your red leaning state, in Pennsylvania, if the number 3 candidate in the last Senate race had been McCormick,
correct,
who lost in the primary to Oz, wouldn't
by a teeny tiny amount.
By a teeny tiny amount, if you had Oz with Condorcet, or top 3 round robin, whatever we're calling it, if you had Fetterman, Oz, and McCormick that's a second. So those are 2 states where the Republicans would have won Senate seats that went to Democrats, which would have given them not just a majority, but a couple vote majority.
New Hampshire also, right? The same election that Chris Sununu won his reelect as for governor, there were in the Senate race, there was the same thing. Because we really have 3 parties in America right now. We have the MAGA party, the traditional Republican Party, and the Democrats. And the Republican primary had a MAGA candidate named Don Bolduc and a traditional Republican that Sununu backed named Chuck Morse. He was the president of the state Senate in New Hampshire, and he was a traditional moderate Republican. He was like McCormick. He lost, again, the primary by a very narrow margin. And then the Democrat, Maggie Hassan, beats the crazy Bolduc candidate. But Chuck Morse would have been the Condorcet winner in a top 3 system in New Hampshire. So in a state that leans a little bit blue, yeah, Republicans would do a lot better in a top 3 world than in the
I guess my question is, if you have 3 states, and we just mentioned 3, where the Republicans would have won the Senate, why aren't Republicans, more of the Rob Portman Republicans, supporting this?
This is the $60 zillion question. Now, the good news on Portman is he has started an institute at the University of Cincinnati called the Portman Center, or the Portman Institute. And he has talked about being interested in electoral reform. I have not yet had an opportunity to meet with him directly, but I've met with the director of his center, and his name is Andy Lewis, and I send Andy my stuff, and Andy likes it and says he forwards it on, and is intrigued by it. So I think there is hope to getting Portman interested in this specifically. That just hasn't happened yet. And if any of you have suggestions about how to be a more of effective advocate of this idea, whether in Ohio or elsewhere,
Ned, have you talked?
Marketing is not my specialty at all. I know election law, but I don't know the business of trying to get this adopted. And so I welcome any suggestions.
Have you had any contact with No Labels directly?
No, I have not.
Ned, here's all you want to know about marketing. So some people think a lot, including me, about the difference in marketing and sales. So sales is about making the horse drink the water. And marketing is about making the horse thirsty. That's all you need to know. Okay, I'll go silent again.
All right, that's great.
Bill, you had a question?
Yeah, the issue for me is I want to go back and reemphasize the naming of this and Condorcet and so forth. And I just want to emphasize convergence as opposed to round robin. For example, in my view, convergence is the essential concept, and people understand it. And people are very frustrated with the fact that the Congress and the government as a whole is doing nothing because they're not converging. So convergence, I think, would have great appeal. And keep that in mind. It's very important to the success of this idea if we have the right name.
I have an idea for you, Ned. How about the three-choice system?
Okay, well, let me suggest as a follow-on to this call, which I found quite fascinating. I'd like to see certainly our internal organization focus a little bit on the marketing questions, perhaps focusing on some of the states that you mentioned that are potentially the best candidates to try this out. And I do think we have some entry points. You know, in the case of Pennsylvania with Thornburg, we have some entry possibilities through the League of Women Voters in Florida, if Eileen hasn't alienated them yet. And I think through with Peter has got some thoughts for both one of the southern states as well as Arizona. So I think we can brainstorm a little bit on where we could do the best marketing. And
I would say Arizona, we should all support the effort that's going on right now that's been led by somebody that Peter introduced me to named Sarah Smallhouse.
Yeah.
Because that reform is flexible enough to allow this system in it. So I wouldn't want to derail that effort. I think that's a really important effort there. And I think that the strategic judgment that people other than me should make is, do you want to go to an initiative state to try to bypass the state legislature in a state where that can be done? It's obviously incredibly expensive to run an initiative campaign to gather the signatures and, you know, do the media outreach. If you think there is a state legislature like Pennsylvania with the governor where you think you have a shot at actually getting a reform coalition in the legislature to do it, you know, that would be less expensive and potentially easier, but I just don't know where those legislative coalitions are possible.
Well, we'll try to give that some thought. I think certainly the Maine has shown its ability to occasionally do things through legislative as well as initiative. And I think we've got some good ideas here. I really am excited at the possibility, and I think we can get other intelligent people to recognize that it isn't just a variation of top two or top four. I think that's key. I don't know, have you talked to Catherine Gale about this at all?
I've not talked to her about the specific top three version. I did have a conversation in 21 with her directly and some of her team on, you know, I was calling it round robin back then, and I tried to convince her, you know, to embrace the round robin methodology of ranked choice ballots. And she was sophisticated in the conversation. She's very knowledgeable and smart. She, a little bit like the fair vote crowd at least at that time, said, you know, we're full steam ahead on the idea that we've been developing. We really don't want to get distracted by any other ideas. I have not talked to her. I had 2 or 3 conversations with her in 2021. I don't think I've talked to her since then.
I see Mike Koenig is on the call as well. Is he still alive? Can he make any suggestion? Mike, are you there? Maybe he walked away from his his phone, but it just seems to me that people have to focus on it, and maybe it's a matter of timing as well. I agree with you. The Arizona thing first is to get the constitutional change made so that it's got room for trying something else. But then this would look like a great laboratory to try it. And I think from our point of view, 2028 is the earliest that's going to affect any presidential election. But certainly the possibility of trying it out in a few states before that would make a lot of sense.
Mike, before we close, Linda Sweeney has her hand up. Linda, do you want to ask a question?
I've been involved on your calls, I think, since you started. And it occurs to me that here we are trying to make Congress, for instance, work better by hiring more people in the middle. Yet we're really afraid that one party or the other might take over the House or the Senate. And I want to remember that this group started with Michael Porter's stuff about how the parties they run too much for their own benefit, and we have to make these elections work for us. So maybe other things need to be changed in addition to this top three, so we don't worry about one vote going to one side or the other.
Okay,
Just a comment.
So my response to you is, how about joining our team and helping?
I'll think about it.
Okay.
I love this issue, but I'm so busy with other things right now.
Okay.
All right, Peter, do you want to wrap it up?
I just want to say
Just one,
Yeah.
one. Yeah, there were some questions about, will everybody get the chat? Yes, we'll send out recordings to everybody who registered and could not attend as well as those. So, and Linda, we are interested in other things also, like gerrymandering. Go to our
Yes.
website and
Yes,
yeah,
I know.
thank you.
Okay.
And I just want to say this was really fascinating. I mean, I don't normally end up after an hour and a half thinking, boy, I really learned a lot today. This is really interesting. But Ned, I can't tell you how much I thank you for this.
Well, I thank you. I've enjoyed getting to know you and Mike and working with you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to present these ideas. And I think that I like the doctor methodology. I may not be the hands-on person who can work with the patient, but this idea isn't useful unless doctors prescribe it as medicine. So democracy is a team sport, right? I mean, no one person is going to solve the crisis that we're currently living in. So if we can figure out a ways to work together to heal the patient, let's do it.
Great.
Well,
Thank you.
I don't think this will be the last time we talk about this, Ned. We really are excited, and you've really got a great idea that is more novel than most people realize, but at the same time is based on some very sound political science that goes back at least 300 years.
And when Mike was a kid.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great meeting.